Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and just a little bit ago, 1939 has put out a dev blog talking about the reserve cards that are going to be returning in the September update for the game. There are 18 of these in total, all of them being reworked, meaning they are completely new cards essentially, and today I'm just going to give my own thoughts about them and talk about them for a little bit. Now, I am a bit sick at the moment, so I apologize if my voice sounds weird, but otherwise, let's just go ahead and jump right into these new cards. So let's start by talking about our first card. That is Tactical Withdrawal. Tactical Withdrawal is a 1-credit order for Britain that is reading, retreat a friendly unit in the front line and fully repair it. It can operate again this turn. So operating again means that a unit will be able to either move or attack again, or if it's a tank, it'll be able to move and attack. And that is going to probably be its main niche, because as the blog points out, allowing a unit to move and attack again can allow you to essentially double up on the damage you deal, but also it stacks with Fury, meaning that Fury units can attack twice, be pulled back, and attack twice again. This could potentially be the big niche of Tactical Withdrawal, because you are essentially able to double up any of your Fury units to do a ton of damage. I don't expect this to be actually a serious deck. A British frontline deck has never really materialized, and they would need like an actual expansion based around it. But I do think that we'll definitely see like some fun highlights where people are, as the article says, using like Blitzkrieg and Tactical Withdrawal to make one Humber deal like 20 damage just on its own. It's a fun card, but not one that I expect to be like an actual powerhouse card in top decks. Next up, we have a British tank, the Cromwell Mark IV, which is now a 4-credit, 2-operation cost, 3/5 tank with Guard, Heavy Armor 1, and the effect, when an enemy unit is pinned, suppress it. So this is actually looking to be a pretty good overall unit. I would expect this to be probably one of the go-to 4-cost guards for the British while it remains in rotation. Heavy Armor 1 is surprisingly tough to deal with. Even though we haven't had a lot of units with Heavy Armor, being forced to trade into Heavy Armor against like aggro is debilitating and adds essentially like 3 or 4 health on this. Imagine if like a Japan aggro deck had to like trade this down with a bunch of like 2 and 3 attack units. This becomes more like a 3/9 in terms of stats. So that can be very, very powerful. On top of this, being a tank means it's also more proactive in slower matches. You can just move it and attack with it to apply pressure. Combine this with the fact that it also is making pin cards better by suppressing, which can get rid of effects and all various things while still leaving it pinned, means that I think the Cromwell is going to be a very, very common 4-cost guard. I'd be surprised if other 4-cost guards push it out, although it does have a very high standard to reach with Glamour Boys. Will people still just run 4 Glamour Boys and ignore the Cromwell, or will Cromwell maybe make people kind of do a split between them, or will they just play all of them? That is probably the main question that needs to be answered once we get to play with these cards. Then we have the Royal West Kents, which are a new British Guard. It is actually the same cost as the Cromwell. It is a 4-credit, 1-operation cost infantry guard. It has 4/4 as the stat line, and it also has Blitz, with the effect that your other guard units have +2 attack and Blitz. So this is a very proactive guard. I would say this is probably the single most proactive guard we have ever seen in cards. Blitz is always a very, very powerful effect. Being able to trade down as you wish is very powerful. It is proactive by being able to grab the front line, and it makes all of your other guard units just as proactive. As an example, if you play the Royal West Kents, something like Polish Legions become 4/2 Blitz infantry, which trade extremely well. That is potentially very, very strong. And even cards like Glamour Boys become 5/6 Blitz infantry, There's potentially a lot of power here, and this would be a unit that I think also is going to sit very close with the Cromwell. I think the Cromwell is overall better on a pure defensive standard. Heavy armor and its effect are just overall better, but I think the Royal West Kents does offer a very proactive thing, and if you have a lot of guards, the Royal West Kents is a really good way to transfer your defensive tools into much more offensive tools, which can potentially be very powerful. The German Suppression is returning. It is a 1-credit order that reads, suppress target unit, draw a card if you have an air unit. So obviously, from a thematic point, this is a big win. The card Suppression actually suppresses now. That's cool. But from a standpoint of, is this card good? I'd say yes. So Suppression, we've seen with Duress that a 0-credit suppress target unit was enough to see consistent play in more tempo-based decks. Now, paying 1 credit to just suppress a unit is worse overall, and I think if it was just that, you'd maybe not really see this, but the fact that it has the potential to draw a card and cycle itself if you have an air unit is very powerful. Germany at the moment has a handful of airplanes that almost every German deck runs. That's the Arado AR-196 and the Heinkel HE-115. There are a couple others like Comet that also see a lot of play, although I don't think you'd use that a lot with Suppression. Maybe, actually, because you could get around guards with it. But I think that combined with other ally nations maybe adding a couple planes means Suppression might be a decently reliable way to cycle on top of suppressing units. And that can be very, very powerful. I expect this to see play in more proactive German decks, but maybe even slower decks run a copy or two if they're really having a good amount of aircraft that are able to trigger this. Next up, we have Breakthrough, a 3-credit German order that reads, deal 3 damage to target unit. If it is destroyed, your units operate for 1 less this turn. Breakthrough I expect to be kind of like one of the new, gold standard German aggro removal orders. And that is just because it is able to both remove a unit and then it makes your board operate for cheaper, allowing you to more effectively seize the front line and overall just have a big tempo swing for an on-rate removal order. We've seen in the past that 3-credit deal 3 damage to a unit with an upside has seen play, and this is a really good version of that for aggressive tempo-based decks. I would be surprised if this doesn't pop up in something like German tank aggro or even something like the various mid-range shells that can really seek to benefit this due to all of their low operation cost units. And then the final German card of these reworks is the Pack 40. An iconic piece that never saw play because it was really bad is now been reworked into a very, very powerful card. It is a 4-credit 1 operation cost artillery. It is a 2/2 with ambush and the deployment effect, destroy target enemy unit that costs 2 or less. Draw a card if it is a tank. That is really good. So a 4-credit 2/2 with a sudden strike stapled onto it would probably be enough to be played on its own. Sudden strike has been a very reliable anti-aggro card for Germany in a long time, and cards like Flame Panzer and others have shown that similar effects do see a lot of play in keeping aggro in check. Pack 40 is essentially a bigger Flame Panzer with the benefit of being arguably a better overall body, as a 2/2 artillery can get free trades if the enemy doesn't deal with it. It also has ambush, so small units can't effectively attack into it. And if it is a tank you blow up, you get to draw a card off of this. This seems really, really powerful, and I would expect that this becomes at least a couple copies as a staple for slower German decks. If German Control doesn't run Pack 40, I would be quite surprised, because having this alongside Flame Panzer means that on turns like 2 through 4, you are constantly developing a board while also blowing up enemy cards. And that seems like a very, very powerful curve that aggro decks are going to have a hard time actually mounting aggression through while keeping you in check. Then, going on to Men of Steel, we have a new Soviet order. It is 1 credit to give your unit, and a choose 1 effect that reads, give your units +1 heavy armor, or add the hammer to your hand. The hammer, for those that don't know, is a 3 credit, deal 6 damage to target ground unit. It is a pretty good removal order, and Men of Steel definitely benefits from that. We have seen in the past that having orders that have like kind of one niche effect, but then also being able to turn themselves into removal, have seen a decent amount of play. Stuff like Red Dawn is the one that jumps to mind. Now, heavy armor is something that probably isn't going to be like a deck theme yet, even though this expansion or this set of reworked cards are building towards that. It's probably going to take like another couple pushes before that becomes a serious thing. But this is a far more reliable enabler for that, because having a 4 credit hammer kind of kicking around is not exactly amazing, but if heavy armor does have its benefits on top of that, it becomes far more appealing. And I expect that like eventually, if heavy armor becomes a real thing, Men of Steel is going to be there as kind of like a card that helps glue the deck together. Next up, we have the Su-85, a new Soviet tank that is a 4 credit, 1 operation cost standard. It has 5 attack and 3 defense, and it reads the following of your HQ gains +3 defense when you attack with a Soviet tank. So, at face value, let's just ask the question of how many times do you need to attack before the Su-85 kind of makes itself worthwhile. If it attacks 1 time, a 5/3 that gives your HQ 3 defense probably would not be played in a serious manner. Meaning we kind of need to attack 2 times in order to make the Su-85 into a worthwhile card. But once we do, that means that you are essentially playing a 4 credit 5/3 that almost heals you for fortification levels of healing and has the potential to do so even higher. At the moment, there is not a lot of really good like Soviet tanks that are clearly like synergizing with this. A lot of Soviet tanks either are kind of too poorly statted or they're a bit too like expensive to operate in order to like reliably do this. However, the fact that Soviets do have healing and the fact that this can stack and that it works anytime any Soviet tank attacks is really, really good at enabling like future decks. I expect that, kind of similar to Men of Steel, like if a Soviet like tank deck is to come around, the Su-85 is going to be a core part of it because it's going to give you such a good way to stabilize on like turns 5 or 6 if you have like T-60s or other like low operation cost tanks that can pretty much attack the turn you play the Su-85 and give you a ton of healing. And then we have the KV-2. The KV-2 is now a 7 credit, 2 operation cost tank. It is 7/5 stats with heavy armor 2, and it has the effect that reads, order damage to a friendly unit is reduced by its heavy armor. Essentially, this is making heavy armor stop both combat damage and order damage. So, for example, the KV-2 is a lot closer to a 7/7 at its baseline. Only deployments are really able to get around this effect, but there's not a lot of really high damage deployment effects, meaning the KV-2, although it is still very slow, potentially could make a board very, very durable, especially if you're using stuff like Men of Steel alongside with it. Now, that overall is probably going to be too slow at the moment, but if there are more like heavy armored units that come out, guards especially that have heavy armor like the Cromwell or maybe stuff in the future, the KV-2 might be a really strong way to just like make it incredibly hard for people to punch through boards that are, you know, stacked with heavy armor. And it's a pretty solid threat on its own now that it's only 2 operation cost and has 7 attack. It's going to take a while to probably come around, but it'll be fun to play around with and might legitimately be a serious late game threat in the future. Next up, we have a new US Elite being reworked, the B26 Marauder. This is a 4-credit, 2-operation cost bomber with a 3/4 stat line, heavy armor 1, and your non-targeting deployment effects trigger twice. What this means is that essentially any deployment effect that does not explicitly need you to choose a unit will trigger twice. So things like the B17 is probably the example everybody's going to think about. But this also means other deployment effects like Glamour Boys, stuff like 20th Panzer Grenadier, the 332nd Engineer Regiment. All of these effects are going to double up, meaning you get more cards, you heal for way more, you gain extra credit slots. There's a lot of potential for this, although you do probably need to save this until the late game, as you really want to be able to play this and then immediately play at least one other good deployment effect with it to get some value out of it. Maybe there's a world where you go like turn 2 War Machine into B26 and it's too hard for the enemy to answer. But with suppression and various removal effects, I think that's risky. But potentially this could allow you to have a lot of value if it sticks around for even one turn. But if you set it up correctly, ramp might be able to also generate a lot of value just with it in one singular turn. Then the next card is Overwhelming Force, a US order. It is 5 credits and reads, choose and discard a unit. Give its attack and defense to target friendly infantry or tank. Now, this is a card that I think is kind of going to fall into the similar thing of the tactical withdrawal of being a meme card. There is the potential that you are able to use Overwhelming Force to discard something like the King Tiger, give a 1-cost tank +10/+10, and then kill somebody with it. That's all fine and funny. But in a serious deck, I don't think there is like enough here to really make it stand out. It's just too much effort for its high cost in order to effectively be used. And you have to probably be running like discard support, but the problem is that like the units you're discarding are not exactly like the best stat wise. If they were like bigger stats, like the Ginga was like a 5/5 or like a 6/5, then this would actually be really good. I think this would be a lot more playable. But as it stands, I think this is going to be another card that you see pop up and be like a fun meme because you know, someone like killed you out of nowhere with like a 10/10 buff. But otherwise, I think it's too many hurdles to jump through for what it's trying to do. And the final US card is the A24 Banshee. This is a 6-credit, 2-operation cost bomber. It is a 3/3 with heavy armor 1 and deployment. Deal damage to target enemy unit equal to your unspent credits. So this is a card that is definitely pure ramp. It is going to need you to really wait until you are at like 12 credits in order to play this. However, once you're at like 12 or more credits, this is almost becoming a 6-credit 3/3 bomber that blows up target enemy unit. Being able to like deal like 5 or 6 damage with this is really powerful. That's a lot of damage, and it kills the vast majority of units out there. Keep in mind, it is any target enemy unit, meaning you can hit enemy bombers, you can hit guards, you can hit stuff in the front line or the back line. Like, there's a lot of targets that you can hit with it, and that flexibility is something that Ramp might really appreciate. It's definitely a nice option for something like Bomber Mafia. It's, I think, above bar compared to other, like, bombers that have been in there, like the B25 Mitchell and whatnot. And I'll be curious to see if this actually pops up in something like, say, an actual ramp list, because there's a lot of slots that it's being fought for, but at least from Bomber Mafia, I think you'll expect to see this. But maybe it's even good enough that, like, you run maybe a copy or two in ramp if you really need, like, some good targeted removal later in the game and your ally nation isn't really providing that. Moving on to the final major nation of Japan, let's talk about Shabata Regiment. Shabata Regiment is a new Japanese infantry. It is a 1 credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It is a 1/3 that has the effect when the enemy gives an order, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ. I believe that Shabata is going to be the most powerful card coming out of this entire rework. And the reason for this is just that's so much damage. Shabata is such a hard to deal with threat that just sits in the back line and severely punishes you for playing any orders, period. Just for reference, something like Mito Regiment is a 3 credit 2/3 that when it dies deals 2 damage, and for a long time it has seen fairly consistent play. Shabata Regiment is bar minimum the same unless you can trade it down with units, but best of luck trading down a 1/3 early in the game that is sitting in the backline against Japan aggro. I think that this is going to end up probably receiving a nerf in the next balance patch, or it might even be emergency patched. I'm going to take my bold stance. I think this is as strong as Red Devils is, if not stronger, because of the fact it is a standard. Meaning you're going to see this a lot. You're going to see people stack these in the back line, making every order deal like 4 to 6 damage. And it's pretty much going to make Japan aggro just one of the best decks in the game. I think this was a mistake to go out like this, but I guess we'll see. Maybe we'll look back and laugh at it, but I have a hard time imagining this is not like extremely dominating in the early game to an unhealthy point. In a little less gloomy news, let's talk about Outmaneuver, which is a very interesting card. It is a 1 credit Japanese order that says target Japanese unit has 0 operation cost this turn. If it has smokescreen, it gets +2/+2. Now, 1 credit to give a unit +2/+2 is really strong, especially when it's also operating for free. And I think the combination of these two effects is enough to make Outmaneuver a legitimate option to consider. It is a Japanese-only land of the free, which actually works quite well in Japan, as stuff like Shiden really can benefit from having like a very low operation cost. Shiden and Outmaneuver means you're able to on turn 6 deal 8 damage, which you're not getting the buff, but that doesn't matter because that is some extra utility you can get out of Outmaneuver. But then, if you're using a couple smokescreen units, such as the P1Y1 and the Type 4 artillery piece, both of which are 4-drop smokescreen units, you're able to maybe have a very legitimate shell of smokescreen options, and this makes them very, very, very big. Like, just as an example, the P1 bomber becomes a 6/7 when it attacks, and it is operating for free, and that's just really strong for a 4-credit bomber. The Type 4 becomes a 5/5 artillery piece that is extremely hard to deal with. I imagine this could be a very legitimate option if you're playing sort of a Japan deck that is like playing some of those smokescreen mid-range units. The Japan-Finnish salvage decks were probably the one that played those the most, so maybe Outmaneuver can go into those decks. We haven't seen those a whole lot as Japan aggro has gone into other things, but maybe this is enough to re-encourage that as more of a mid-range deck. It'll be interesting to explore and see how it shakes out. And the final Japanese card is a card that is now being reworked to help SelfEdit Denial. It is a 3-cost Japanese infantry. It is operating for 0. It is a 3/3 with the effect Destruction. Deal damage to the enemy HQ equal to the credit slots you have lost this battle. So 144th looks to be potentially very powerful. It is quite slow to get going. If you're playing this on turn 3, it is very underwhelming. However, if you lose 2 credits, this is maybe a playable card on its own, as Mito Regiment has seen play in the past. But SelfEdit Denial is known to lose 3, 4, 5 credits, and when you start getting to those values, 144th becomes actually a very dangerous finisher. It gives you a lot of hard to deal with burn that just makes it so your enemy either kind of has to suppress it or have the healing to outlive it, or they're going to die. Especially when you combine that with the explosiveness of one roof and the high tempo tools that SelfEdit Denial has, this might be a very, very powerful finisher in the deck that helps to give you that going over the top nature by playing it down alongside the rest of your board and having things that can help finish the game, before you run out of steam. And then, moving on to the minor nations, we only have 3 cards to talk about. The first one is Sabotage. It is the returning French card. It now reads as a 7-credit order that says, choose one of 3 cards in the enemy hand. Discard it and add a copy to your hand. Now, this is going to be a very interesting card. I expect people to really hate this card, but that is why it is also a 7-cost card, so it is very, very expensive. Because this is essentially, you get to look at 3 cards in the enemy hand, and you get to take one and put it into yours. This means that if the enemy is relying on, say, a comet in order to kill you, or say they have their research, Sabotage is able to just take it, and now you have it and they don't. That is really, really powerful. It is very, very disruptive and means that decks that are trying to play control have to be very cautious running into it, because they will otherwise just get destroyed if you manage to actually steal their win con. They need to have either backup win cons, or they need to win through value and not have any singular card that is trying to win the game with them. It is very expensive, and also it is in France, which France does have Mill, which is a deck that is very, very powerful at the moment. So maybe there's room to fit Sabotage into that. Although filling the enemy hand means you also are less likely to hit a worthwhile card, so there might be a little anti-synergy there. But otherwise, if a more traditional French control comes around, this is probably really, really powerful and really helps to give France a very strong attrition option by depriving the enemy of resources and letting you then play those resources. This is probably going to be one of those cards that anytime it becomes halfway usable, everybody's going to hate it, but hopefully its high cost keeps it from ever becoming too overwhelming in the meta. Moving on to Italy, we have the SM-79. This is a Italian bomber. It is 4 credits and 2 operation costs for a 3/3 with deployment, trigger a friendly non-targeted deployment effect on a friendly unit. So this is essentially in the same vein as something like the B26 Marauder we talked about before. It is a interesting bomber in that Italy itself doesn't really have a lot of effects that works with this, but nations like Germany and US have generally used Italy in a control-based option, and this allows you to sort of double dip on high-powered deployment effects. If you just want an example of some options, we talked about with the US things like the B17 is a great option. Germany has a lot of really good mid-cost effects that work with this. 20th Panzer Grenadier, the Panzer 3H is a good one. Leopold is probably one of the most notable, being able to bounce the board over and over. You have the Panzerzug being able to make multiple 3/3s over and over again. There's potentially some interesting things there. I think Italy control is still a bit lacking in terms of a healing effect in order to make German Italy control relevant again, but this is potentially a good value card that maybe a copy or two could sneak into a deck like that if you're either playing it or if it ever comes around in a serious manner again. And then our final card is Hell, which is now a 2-credit order that says give a Legion unit +6 defense and your HQ is immune to damage. So Hell is just such a big wall in order to deal with. Just add a baseline. This is a 2-credit order that makes your 2/2 into a 2/8. Which is really big, and it also makes you impossible to kill until it is dealt with. which essentially means that assuming the enemy doesn't like bounce it or otherwise like suppresses it, Hell is a 2-credit heal for 6, which is really good. The fact that like this is such a powerful like defensive tool that demands an answer is really powerful, especially because Legions has the tendency to go wide and this goes tall, which actually has some nice synergies because going tall on one unit demands answers that are different than answers for going wide, which can stretch how much removal the enemy has. Even one Legion sticking around can become a monster of a unit to deal with. And hell, slots are tight in terms of Legions slots because you need a lot of intel and things like generators for Legions. But if you do play this, it's going to make a Legion unit very, very hard to deal with early on. And even later on, this is just very hard to trade down, essentially without hard removal. And with that, we are at the end of the dev blog. These changes are coming out on the 19th, and there will also be another video I'm going to be making about the balance patch, which we have been teased about with a nerf to the B24J and a buff to stubborn defense, and we'll talk about more of those when we see the whole list. But if you are interested in that, make sure to like and subscribe in order to not miss out on any of that. But overall, these cards, these 18 returning, I think some of them, like Hell and many of the German cards and various other ones, are immediately going to jump into decks that are already in like the high end of the meta. Some sets like the Soviet ones I think aren't going to be as immediately impactful, but they set some very strong groundworks for what I assume will be future decks. I think it's very well to expect that like the Soviets are going to get more heavy armor support, seeing as we got 2 new cards caring about heavy armor. We also are going to see probably more like non-targeted deployment effects, maybe in Italy because of that new bomber. Like, there's a lot of potential here that seems to be planting the seeds for future stuff. So if a card doesn't make a splash right now, maybe in winter it will, maybe a future balance patch will fix some things and make them better. But overall, it'll be a very interesting thing. This will definitely inject some new life into the game. And I'm personally quite excited to sit down and play with these for real. But again, anyway, if you've watched all the way to the end, thanks so much. Again, like and subscribe for future cards content. We'll be talking about the balance patch and whatnot here in probably a couple days before the update comes out, so don't want to miss that. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching and have a good day.